hub,
and spoke. Audio Collective.
Commercial Type is now shipping Double Accent Pop, our first comprehensive type specimen in nearly a decade, featuring our full library in a compact paperback format. This book is intended for reading as much as it is for looking at type, with an essay by writer Molly Lambert exploring why some of the most iconic duos in pop music history flourished or flopped. Workshop's founder Chris Wu had free reign on the design, giving each spread its own layout and showcasing the entire Commercial Type library. The specimen is a buoyant fusion of content and form, irreverent, opinionated, and exhilarating. Find it now at commercialtype.com.
While many printers have shifted their focus, Freeport Press has remained committed to the art of print. For companies that need a printing partner for magazines, look no further than Freeport Press. We offer the capabilities a customer would expect from a national printer while offering the level of customer service clients expect from a family-owned business. Freeport Press. We do print, and we do it well.
FreeportPress.com.
The golden age was the golden age because magazines were phenomenal then. All editors were firing on all cylinders and everybody was competition. And there were issues where I thought, oh my God, this is so wonderful, this issue. It's got everything you want in a magazine. And then if I put out something that I thought was less than that, I thought I've lost the touch. It's all downhill from here. And I could always tell other editors who were anxious because their magazines were better.
This is Print is Dead, Long Live Print, a podcast about magazines and the people who made and make them. I'm Deborah Bishop.
I'm George Gendron.
I'm Patrick Mitchell.
I'm Dana Brown. I'm a writer and the former deputy editor of Vanity Fair. Now, if you know anything about me, which statistically you don't, unless, shameless plug, you read my memoir, Dilettante, about my time at Vanity Fair and the golden age of the magazine business, which statistically you didn't. The only reason I have a career at all is because of today's guest on Print is Dead, Long Live Print. He hired me in the mid-90s to be his assistant, or as he likes to say, rescued me off the scrap heap. And then, like gum on the bottom of his shoe, he could never seem to get rid of me. I'm talking, of course, about Graydon Carter, former editor of Vanity Fair, Spy, the New York Observer, and now co-editor and co-founder of Airmail. He's here to talk about his memoir, When the Going Was Good, a title that, with signature understatement, suggests things were once better than they are now, which feels correct. But his book isn't just about magazines. It's about a time when media was glamorous and powerful and vital, when New York was still New York, when the world he had a hand in shaping still existed. It's not nostalgia, it's a public service. Because Graydon didn't just edit and create magazines, he built worlds. He predicted the cultural weather. He made journalism feel essential and, more importantly, cool. I was lucky enough to work for him at Vanity Fair for almost 25 years, back when magazines mattered, when people still returned phone calls and parties had seating charts instead of hashtags, when the media wasn't just people making videos about sandwiches, and when style wasn't a brand collab, and when you could still smoke indoors without a visit from HR. Oh, hold on one second. Hey, you kids! Get off my lawn. Sorry. Graydon began as my boss, but quickly became a mentor, then a friend, and it's a friendship that continues to this day. So enjoy this conversation with Graydon Carter as he looks back on the chaos, the glamour, and the thrill of a better time. Back when, yes, the going was very, very good.
Do you have any idea at all how many interviews you've done?
I've done a few. I mean, I've probably done 24, but in Canada, Britain, and America.
This has got to be one of the most successful book tours ever.
What? Well, I think the timing was good for my book in that I think it's will do better now 3 months after Trump returns to the White House. And I don't know, I think it's a nice aspirational book, and I think it goes back to a happier time in our lives.
Boy, does it ever.
Professionally and personally, yeah.
Yeah, certainly professionally for many of us.
Oh, yeah.
And once in a while, people accuse kind of the legendary editors of nostalgia and sentimentality, but I don't find that. I find that the good conversations have a lot of value in addition to that. But there's something about magazine making where there's a tangible product at the end of the process, and you're working with kind of an incredibly diverse group of really bright, inquisitive, passionate people. That's just thrilling.
Oh, I agree with that. And it's funny because magazines still have an aura around them. And I think young people would just love working for magazines if they can find one that can pay them.
Yeah.
I know the people we have at Airmail that we treat it as a magazine, and there's about a dozen young people, all in their 20s, and they're as smart as anybody I've ever worked with.
Yeah, I have a bunch of former students that have occasionally worked with us on a variety of projects, and they're extraordinary.
Yeah. No, I think this generation is wonderful.
I do too. So we want to have a conversation about the book, but about your experiences in the magazine space. And I want to start with growing up in Canada. Part of my family is French Canadian. I feel a kinship here. So you said that half of the cultural influences for you growing up in Canada were American and British. And I'm curious, what magazines from either country were you exposed to, and what magazines really engaged you?
Yeah, so it was largely movies and television and books in terms of the culture. We got American shows like Bonanza and Ed Sullivan. We also, in the movie theaters in Ottawa, the Ealing Studio comedies would come to town. So I knew all of those shows like Tony Hancock's Half Hour. So growing up in Canada, you get a grounding in the cultures and especially the humors of both places. Our magazines at home were largely American. They were Life and Time and Esquire and The New Yorker. And those were my parents' magazines when I was growing up. And then I had my own subscriptions when I got older. And that was a window to the world to me because magazines tell you more about the here and now and the way we live than newspapers do, and they do it before books do. So the magazines were an important element of my life. I love them. I still love magazines.
Someone at the Boston event during the Q&A actually asked you, why magazines for you? And you said something about the fact that, just repeating what you just said now, that if you wanted a picture of life, particularly in America, you looked at Life magazine in the 50s and Esquire in the 60s. Could you explain just briefly what you felt each of those magazines did that was so unique or special?
Life every week would bring you the ways of the world, especially the way Americans were living. And it seemed the people lived in a warmer climate than we did. They had less snow by and large, unless you lived in Minnesota or Maine. And it just looked like they were having more fun. But granted, that's because they were in magazines. And that was the 50s and the early 60s. Then Esquire magazine in the 1960s was the definitive magazine of the counterculture and of the establishment in a strange way. And it's an anti-establishment, but you got a better portrait of the establishment that way, at least the American one.
That's an interesting way to put it. I think Esquire provided an interesting view of the establishment through the eyes of the anti-establishment.
Yeah. And then New Times magazine, which I thought was brilliant. I thought Willie Morris's Harper's magazine was brilliant. And this just formed a big part of my, not worldview so much as, but what I wanted to do with my life.
It's interesting you mentioned New Times. I was at New York Magazine in the early 70s, and New Times had launched, and they were headquartered right down the street from us. And it was interesting because Clay and the senior staff ignored them and sniffed about them.
At their peril.
And the young staff adored the magazine. Every young writer we knew, suddenly they didn't want to write for New York anymore. They wanted to write for New Times.
Yeah. New Times was a revolutionary magazine.
It was. Why do you think it didn't last longer?
Because probably I am basing this on absolutely nothing, but the fact is that magazines are a brutal financial proposition. It's time consuming and costly to color correct pages, to print the magazine, to bind the magazine, to ship the magazine, and then to wait 120 days before you got paid for the copies you sold.
Yeah.
You needed advertising to bolster that. And maybe the counterculture advertising was drifting mostly to Rolling Stone in those days. I don't know. But also it's a small magazine. Small magazines are famous for the tininess and the bitterness and just the infighting that goes on to anything that's quite small. I've never experienced that except for one time in a magazine, but I know it exists.
We have to talk afterwards because that would make a great podcast for someone.
Little magazine.
Yes. So let's reframe that question that somebody at City Space asked you earlier this week. and say, what destination do you turn to for a picture of America today with all of its conflicts and contradictions?
I mean, I think that, first of all, there are a number of extraordinary magazines still operating in the country, and I love The Atlantic, I love The New Yorker, I like New York Magazine for my world here in the city. But I think TV does a lot of that now, in the way that movies used to give you a portrait of the, say, 1970s. The movies were incredible at doing that. Television does a very decent job of that. And I mean scripted television. I don't mean TV news.
Yeah. Give me an example of what you watch then. Something specific.
Funny enough, I'm trying to think. I do know my wife and I, if we watch TV in the evening, just before we turn off the television, we watch Frasier, simply because I think it's one of the best written shows of all time. And they're like perfect half-hour, 22-minute plays. And it's a really cleansing nightcap to all the stuff you might have read during the day or heard during the day. But I watch everything on television. I watch every major series. I'm trying to watch Mobland now, and I watched, obviously, White Lotus like everybody else. So I watch what everybody else watches, but a lot of British stuff as well. There's a wonderful series called Douglas Goes Cancelled with Hugh Bonneville that I love, that I recommend to everybody. It's on BritBox. I loved it.
It's interesting because when I heard it in one of the interviews, I immediately thought, for me, The Sopranos, The Wire, Friday Night Lights, we're rewatching West Wing.
Just to make you feel better.
Just to make us feel better, yeah, or not.
Yeah, or not, yes.
But just for that Sorkin dialogue, Jesus.
That's a brilliant show. I watched all of those, obviously, as well.
So let's spend some time talking about one of my all-time favorite magazines, Spy.
I'm sure Kurt's told you everything you need to know.
No, I want to hear your version of the story, because I was saying to Patrick earlier today, I don't know why, but I think a lot of people, because Kurt has spoken about this so frequently, that a lot of people think of him as the founder, and it was your idea. But you write in the book something really interesting, Graydon. You say you have no idea where that idea for Spy came from. And a reader is totally unprepared after having read what you had written beforehand, that here's this guy, he's a Canadian, he's an outsider, he seems insecure, and he comes up for this magazine that ends up being ballsy and brash.
No, I was less insecure than I was anxious. I was an anxious person. So the minimal space of difference there. No, I actually spent 7.5, 8 years in New York, and I was a sponge when I came to New York. I always say that people who grew up in New York see the city completely differently than people who come here in their adult years, because the adults come for a reason and they come out of purpose. And if they're like me, they're just sponges for everything about the city, the architecture, the people, the sort of parade floats of people who were in the tabloids every day. And New York had just come out of bankruptcy in the mid 80s. It was getting back on its feet. Banks were all of a sudden not these things where you went to deposit your paycheck, but they were these investment banks, and then that spawned investment bankers. And so there was a flood of money in the city.
Yeah.
And a lot of people had it and wanted to show that they had it, which made it good for journalism. And just accidentally, I was at Life magazine, and I could do my job in about 5 hours a week. And I got terribly bored. And I'd had the idea a couple of years before, and I had the name right off the bat of Spy. It was both the name of the illustrator for these Vanity Fair caricatures at the turn of the century, the last century, in the British Vanity Fair. You've seen them in antique shops. And it was an artist named Leslie Ward who drew under the name Spy. But it was also the name of the magazine that Jimmy Stewart worked for in the Philadelphia Story, one of my favorite screwball type comedies. And so I had the name, and I loved the idea. My previous magazine was the Canadian Review, and it's so many letters that by the time you got it on the cover, the letters were about 32 point. I wanted something to be like 150 point. So Spy accomplished that, and I thought it paid a bit of homage to Private Eye magazine in Britain, which was very influential to us. And in the Philadelphia Stories, magazine empire was called Spy and Dime. And Spy was a takeoff on Time, and Dime was a takeoff on Life. So everything fit together. And then I went looking for a partner. I first talked to my friend Jim Kelly, who was at Time. And I think Jim had a good inclination that he was going to be the editor of Time at some point. And indeed, he did become the editor of Time. But then I talked with Kurt, and we did it over lunch. And by the end of lunch, he was in. And I would never have been able to do it without him. And I love having a partner, and Kurt was the perfect partner for that.
And he, too, an outsider.
Yes, he was less of an outsider than me, but he's from Nebraska. I'm from Canada. And by the way, so many of the editors who made any kind of difference in New York did not grow up on the Upper East Side. Harold Ross came from Aspen, and Clay, I think, came from Missouri. So
You did.
the city had a history of editors who came from somewhere else and saw in New York something that New Yorkers did not see.
That's a good point. In fact, if we had John Huey on this interview right now, John would say, you came from Canada, but I was even more of an outsider. I came from the South.
Yeah.
He talked about how his Southern accent was a source of incredible competitive advantage because people always underestimated him.
That's interesting. Well, perhaps, I got rid of all my Canadianisms when I first came here because I just wanted to get in the melting pot and melt. So it was easier for a Canadian to melt than a Southerner, I suppose, because that accent will always brand you.
So you never walked into Vanity Fair in the morning and somebody said to you, what did you do yesterday? And you said, I fucked the dog.
No, that was the thing that we used to say when I was growing up. If you met a friend and asked what you did that weekend, you'd say, I don't know, fuck the dog. And I never actually heard it the way other people might hear it. So I was at time in my first few months, and I bumped into Jim Kelly on the elevator, and everybody else was in rep ties and button-down shirts and Bush Brothers blazers. And Jim said, what'd you do this weekend? I said, I don't know, fuck the dog. And I could just all of a sudden feel the chill on the elevator and realize how that sounded to somebody who was not Canadian from my boyhood. And that was the last time I've used that expression. I retired it forever.
Well, I grew up in New Jersey, and we had a glossary of those terms. And if I gave you even one example, I would never do another podcast in my life. So we'll transition to something else. In my favorite book about magazine making ever, Spy, The Funny Years.
Funny years, yeah.
Yeah, there are excerpts from notes that you wrote, and it's amazing how many of them focus on tone, style, and sensibility when it comes to the magazine you and eventually you and Kurt wanted to create. Where did that come from? Was it that you felt that other magazines had lost their edge, or was it just, no, this is what you guys want to make?
No, we borrowed in part the writing style from Time magazine of the 50s, which was dense, fact-filled, and often used crude epithets to describe people, and from the sort of breezy detachment in the writing style of Private Eye. So we had a writing style that we wanted. We didn't want humorous writing for us. We wanted journalists who could write, get the story, and make it funny, which was a tall order because all the ones that could do that were employed by the Washington Post and places like the New York Times, and we couldn't afford them, and they wouldn't have come to work for us anyway. So we cobbled together our own house style of writing because we thought it should be a chorus of voices, but all singing in some sort of harmony. And so the first few months were like hundreds of hours of editing on each issue, trying to get the style down. And once we got it down, the other writers parodied that style, and then we were off to the races.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
But we thought if it had to have a look and a voice that was unlike any other magazine.
You succeeded.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, you think so? You guys hired Stephen Doyle, among others. A short time later, Alex Isley, both of them alums of Tibor Kallem's legendary M & Company. What was it about those two, but also about M & Company, that was such a perfect cultural fit for what you guys wanted to do?
Yeah, that was the pentagram of the 80s in a certain way. And they produced a number of great designers, and we didn't want to have goofy typefaces or funny looking layouts. We wanted to have a classical look to it. In the same way we wore jackets and ties to the office, we thought you'll get a lot better reception at standing on the rampart if you're dressed like the establishment, or if you're dressed like a rebel. But we wanted classical typefaces, classical layouts, and these art directors provided that. We had brilliant art directors, and each one added their elements to it. So it was like adding on to a house over a century, say, and somehow it all came together. But we paid a lot of attention to the look of the magazine.
Boy, did you ever. When these guys first showed up, when Stephen first showed up, how much direction did you provide? And if you did, in what form? Were there pages torn from other magazines, sketches, favorite typefaces?
Most of the headline types were serif types because they looked more classical than sans serif. And I don't recall tearing things from other magazines, but we'd had these Italian designers to do the prototypes. And Stephen just built on that and made it better. Each designer added their own flourishes. And yet, if you looked at them, you wouldn't really be able to tell much difference between year 1 and year 5, let's say.
That's very unusual. Usually when you bring even a young designer in, they want to immediately put their own fingerprints all over the design rather than letting it evolve incrementally.
No, Kurt and I were too involved in the look to let that happen. And I think magazines, when they go through sudden, enormous changes, can really turn off the reader, whether it's the design or in the selection of stories. And we wanted a continuity of design and an evolution of design rather than any kind of giant disruption.
The visual identity of the magazine just blew people away right from the beginning, as well as the contents. But this was still a period when a lot of people, including a lot of publishers, just didn't get how important design was becoming to magazines.
Well, New York Magazine, where you worked, obviously did. And that was a big part of what New York was. And I think Rolling Stone, I think Jan had a great eye for Rolling Stone, especially with type. And it's important because magazines, and this helped when I got to Vanity Fair, but magazines are words and images, and you have to pay attention to both in a strange way. And also, we had no budget. So in that respect, having classical type made that more acceptable of having to use stock photography and then original photography. And then we did just a money-saving thing that sort of became a part of other magazines and newspapers. We would take publicity photographs, which you could use for free, and we'd silhouette the heads and we'd use them very small on a page. So you could get 10 people, say, on a page. And that became, I remember even the New York Times started it.
Oh, yeah, that became a thing.
Yeah, and that was just out of desperation because of the budget constraints.
We'll be right back.
Hi, this is Jeremy Leslie at Mag Culture. We're proud to support the Print is Dead podcast because we love magazines too. Visit magculture.com and see why print is far from over. It's just getting started. Read the journal for interviews and reviews, listen to our podcasts, visit our shop in London and online, and come to our live events in London and New York. We love magazines. Subscribe to our newsletter for weekly updates, all at magculture.com.
You're talking about something that is near and dear to my heart, and I want to come back to later in the context of Vanity Fair, but I'll just mention it now, and that is that I ran the creative team at Inc. magazine for 20 years.
I loved Inc. magazine.
Oh, thank you very much.
Oh, yeah.
And we were documenting the rise of an entrepreneurial economy and also of an entrepreneurial business culture as well. And one of the things that you can't help but come away with is I guess I'll call it the power of poverty, that when people don't have access to financial capital, they have to invent. They have to be resourceful. I love that. And the same was true at New York Magazine. A lot of the journalists there would constantly talk about how the really interesting stuff always came what they called the fringes of the culture. And anyway, I love this notion that in the absence of resources, you guys had to find ways to get what you wanted to do, to create the impact that you wanted to have.
Well, it was a very collegial staff and everybody worked together, and there were so many smart people at SPY that the ideas would flow in, and basically Kurt and I were gatekeepers to a filtration system before they actually got it into the magazine. But no idea was too crackpot. And I remember going on the first Annie Leibovitz photo shoot when I came to Vanity Fair, and the catering budget for that one shoot was equal to the editorial budget for an entire issue of SPY. And in fact, there was one issue where I think Kurt and I must have written about 4 stories each under pseudonyms just because we had no money.
Whoa, wait. The catering budget. You got to wrap your mind around.
Well, no, it was because there were probably, 24 people on the crew. This was for a big shoot. And then for the subject, a table must have been 20 feet long, groaning with food. And it probably within, the editorial budget of an issue of SPY.
Oh my God. Okay, we're going to come back to this.
Okay.
Tell us, especially our young listeners, where was SPY located? What was the culture at SPY like? How did you generate story ideas?
Well, SPY, so we took office space in the Puck building. Puck was the first American humor magazine, and this beautiful building down in Soho. And we had the top floor and wonderful offices with beautiful arched brick ceilings. So the offices were really pleasant. And this was a time when rap was just getting started. So people like DJ Jazzy Jeff and the Fresh Prince were in the neighborhood. And most Soho then was not a shopping mall of French and Italian
Yeah.
designers. It was largely mom and pop affairs. It was quite dangerous. There were a lot of nightclubs around. And the idea is we would have a weekly meeting where we had a big table and everybody would scratch their initials into where they were seated. And Kurt would be at one end, I'd be at the other. And often it would be during lunch, and we'd come up with maybe 24 story ideas at a meeting. And by the time you boil it down and rethink the whole thing, maybe 3 or 4 of them wound up in the magazine. But we did
Yeah.
that every week.
So that was the equivalent of a newsroom in a way?
Not a newsroom, because then we went back to our desks. We all had offices.
Yeah.
And they were open. They didn't have ceilings. The walls came up to about, say, 7 feet. So Kurt and I could talk all the time, but we'd have to see each other. But the meetings were vital. It's a very editor-driven magazine. There were more editors than almost anything else at Spy, the people who showed up for work every day. So there's probably at any given time maybe 7, 8 editors, which is a lot for a small magazine, because
Yeah, it is.
also everybody wrote as well. Those meetings are where the ideas came from. And this was a smart crowd. And so the ideas were plentiful.
I want to wrap up about Spy and I want to move over to Vanity Fair, but I can imagine that the pushback from some pretty well-known and influential New Yorkers must have been pretty intense at times. Did it help you and Kurt to have each other to absorb that?
Well, one thing is, the good thing is each one of us would always say, if we were confronted by somebody, that the other one was the person who did the mean stuff, that we did the funny stuff. Having a partner, really, you share the glory, but you share the pain as well. The thing is, we were slightly non grata in the sort of fancier living rooms of New York, so we didn't run into our subjects that much. But there is a telephone system, and I remember we called Jill Crement a champion name dropper once, and then her husband, Kurt Vonnegut, called me and said that she's not a name dropper. She just has a lot of famous friends, and she likes to talk about them at length. And just before he got off the phone, he said, and by the way, if you don't have cancer, I hope you get it. So I thought, that was a first for me, and my feelings were slightly hurt. And we did a story on the most litigious New Yorkers, and one of the people we mentioned was Gore Vidal. He got her number. He called, and I picked up the phone, and he was quite to the point. He said, I don't want to be on that list. He said, I'm not litigious, and if you don't retract that, I'll sue you. He was about to say, you don't understand the contradiction in it. Everybody just hung out. And we worked together 15 years later at Vanity Fair. And one time at a dinner, I brought this up again. I said, do you remember that phone call you made to me where you threatened to sue us if we didn't retract that you were litigious? I said, you didn't see the sort of contradiction, irony in all of this? He went, no. And I said, okay, I just dropped it. I just thought, I'm not going to go there again.
I got to tell you, your book is filled with some of the most priceless one-liners I have ever heard. One of my favorites, another one from Spy, I Keep Delaying moving over to Vanity Fair, where there are also some great one-liners. But this one, maybe we'll use this to wrap up. Now, you're on the phone with your libel lawyer, and he wants you to take something out that's slated for the next issue. And you're getting frustrated. And so you finally say to him, what are you going to do to me if I don't take it out?
He says, I'm going to call your mother. And I said, okay, fine, we'll take it out. But then I had a very good friend, dear friend, John Scanlon, who was a legend in New York. He was a famous PR man. He had worked in the Lindsay administration, a big Falstaffian fellow with big appetites. And we did a story on Larry Tisch when he had taken over CBS and he was gutting the news division. So we did a story on him, and they called him a dwarf billionaire in the story. And John Scanlon, who was then representing Larry Tisch, he called me up, and he often started off a conversation by saying, okay, Graydon, you've gone too far this time. And that's the way he started off this discussion. I said, what are you talking about? He said, Larry. I said, you mean Tisch? He goes, yes. He said, you've gone too far. He said, first of all, Larry is not technically a dwarf. So I wrote that down on a piece of paper, not technically a dwarf. And the next issue, we made a correction saying that a CBS factotum had called us to point out that Larry is not, in end quotes, not technically a dwarf. And then Scanlon called me when he saw that. He was even angrier.
That has to be one of the most priceless corrections in the history of
John and I were lifelong friends after that, but quite often he would a lot of people would start off a conversation by saying, you've gone too far this time. And also at Vanity Fair, by the way.
Listen, I realize we've skipped some wonderful stories about your time at Time magazine, but I want to get to the subject of your wonderful book, When the Going Was Good, and your tenure at Vanity Fair. So it's 1992. You meet Cy Newhouse and agree to edit one of his signature magazines. Now, I know you've told this story to a lot of interviewers, but somehow, Graydon, you've managed every time to tell it as if it's a story you have never told before.
Actually, I told it in Vanity Fair once before, but anyway.
Yeah, but you managed to do it with charm. So anyway, tell the story again for especially for our young listeners
Okay.
that have never heard about I call it the bait and switch story.
It wasn't bait and switch at all, but no, we sold Spy magazine in 1991 to Charles Saatchi, a famous advertising mogul in Britain, and his friend Johnny Pagazzi, who is a famous art collector. And after about 9 months, I left Spy and I took over the New York Observer, which is a sleepy Upper East Side broadsheet. It was on salmon colored paper. It had very beautiful typefaces, sort of cobbled from the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal at the time. And I worked out a plan for it. I brought in some new staff members, some from Spy. And within 6 months, all of a sudden, I had people reading it. It had become a thing. And so then at about the 9-month mark, I started sending complimentary copies to friends of mine, editors in Europe and in America. And Cy Newhouse, who then he had controlled Condé Nast, which owned Vogue, Vanity Fair, The New Yorker, GQ, Architectural Digest, and he also had Alfred A. Knopf and Random House. So he was the biggest cultural force in New York in a certain way, and over a long period of time. And so twice a year, he would go to Europe to inspect his properties over there because there were European editions of most of these magazines. And everywhere he went, he saw a copy of the New York Observer on editors' desks in their in baskets, not realizing that I had actually sent them. They didn't buy them. And so he comes back to America thinking the New York Observer is a big international hit. So he calls me. He said, would you like to meet? And I said, of course. And so it was for Monday. And that weekend, my wife and I were just stewing over this because I thought he was going to offer me something like Details or GQ. And I didn't think I could do a better job than the editors there were. And also, I was really happy at the Observer. I wasn't paid much, but I loved the staff. I loved the frequency. It was being read by a lot of people, and it was becoming a hit. But then I sit down with Cy on that Monday, and he says, I've got 2 magazines, and I wonder if you'd be interested in them. And he said, The New Yorker and Vanity Fair. And my mouth just went completely dry. And I explained that we had made fun of Vanity Fair for the past 5 years at Spy, about the editor, about the house style of writing, about many of the contributors. And so he said, okay, the New Yorker. So I said, okay. And he said, we're going to announce it in 2 weeks. So every night after dinner, I would sit in the kitchen and work on a 6-month, 12-month, 18-month plan to run the New Yorker. And I'm not a disruptor on anything at all. I like incremental changes. I think changes should be so minimal you wouldn't notice them from week to week, but it's boiling a frog at some point. It is different. And so I had this plan, and the day it was going to be announced, Anna Winter said it's going to be the other magazine. She said, act surprised. So Cy called me maybe a half hour later and said it's going to be Vanity Fair. And I said, fine, I'm good with that. But I didn't have a plan for Vanity Fair, and I was worried that if I didn't start work immediately, I wouldn't get paid. Now, knowing Cy now as I came to, he would have said, fine, take 2 months off and work on a plan and then start. But I didn't know enough then. So I started with absolutely no plan, with the staff absolutely despising me. And I don't blame them for despising me. We'd made fun of them for the past 5 years. And so it was like letting the fox into the hen house in a major way. Also, they probably worried that I'd clean house quickly, and that means unemployment. But I didn't fire anybody for 2 years. I actually think I'd fired one person up to that point in my life. And so I tried to work with the staff. I tried to bring them around to my way of working when I like an office with a little drama, but with a lot of respect between colleagues. And I like people to work together rather than against each other. And after 2 years, I'd had enough. And in a 3-day period, I got rid of the 3 major troublemakers at the magazine. And it's funny, things just literally, there was before this, it was an era at Vanity Fair for me. And then there was after this, it just changed in one day. The general mood of the office, people started saying please and thank you and working together and respecting each other's talents and abilities. And it stayed that way for the next 23 years for me.
Boy, can I identify with that story. I never got any better at firing people.
It's horrible.
I'll tell you a story about someone who I'm sure you know and love as I do. He's not with us anymore, but I hired Nelson Aldrich. And oh my God, I just
Became prickly.
he can be prickly, but I came to value my relationship with him in a way that was extraordinary, but it wasn't a great fit. And I think he knew it. I certainly felt that way. And so at one point, I went in and had a long conversation with him. And I just said, look, it's not working. And take your time, but I'd like you to eventually clear out your office. Got a couple of weekends. You can do it. Eventually, I went into Nelson and said, when are you thinking of leaving? And he said, what do you mean? And I said, I fired you. And he said, you did? And he got up, Graydon, and he walked around the desk and he asked me to stand up and he gave me a hug and he said, oh, my dear man, that must have been so difficult for you.
Oh, that's sweet.
Oh, my gosh.
I like that.
I do.
Yeah.
So let's go back to a sense of reluctance, certainly from what I've read in the book, for you to talk explicitly about Tina. But did it ever occur to you, even just for a moment, that she really didn't want to go to the New Yorker? She just wanted to screw you over.
Oh, no. No, to be fair to Tina, I don't think there would be a Vanity Fair had she not preceded me. She saved the magazine.
Yeah, no, I agree.
Cy would have folded it, but he really took a beating the first few years because the expectations were so high. They had made this big mistake of spending, I think at the time was $10 million, which is a lot of money, in this huge advertising campaign announcing the launch of the magazine.
Oh, I remember that.
It was the wrong thing to do. And I remember Bob Levinson, an old advertising man, telling me, nothing kills a bad product faster than good advertising.
Yeah.
And the ad campaign was brilliant. The magazine couldn't possibly live up to that. Even though it was good, I go back and look at those first few issues that Locke did. They were terrific.
You think so?
Yeah, 100%.
That was not the reception of the readers and certainly not other journalists.
I spent a lot of time looking at old issues of Vanity Fair, and his Vanity Fair was exactly what Cy requested. Cy didn't own the New Yorker at the time. He wanted a New Yorker with pictures, and that's what John gave him.
What do you think happened?
I think that the advertising campaign was way too much. This magazine was not going to be a cure for cancer. It was just a magazine, the most anticipated launch in decades and decades. And they oversold it. And I remember there was a column in, I want to say, the New Republic, back when that was a must read, I think by Henry Fairley, that just eviscerated the magazine. And I'm sure the advertisers fled in droves, as they sometimes do. And it was brutal to the magazine. So Tina truly saved the magazine. And I think she probably wanted the New Yorker job because she'd done, 6-7 years at Vanity Fair. Yeah. And I think Cy was happy with her being there and being at Vanity Fair.
I think, I could be wrong about this. I don't know her well. I did a podcast with her, but I think 5 or 6 years is her limit. And then she gets restless. She was at the New Yorker, and after 5 or 6 years, went off with the Weinstein Group, different conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah. So tell us about, I love this, the list of banished words.
Oh, God, yeah. Well, I don't have it right in front of me, but it was just, there was a baroqueness to the writing. So a restaurant wasn't a restaurant, it was a boîte, and a book wasn't a book, it was a tome, and people didn't say something funny, they chortled or they quipped. There's so many words. I hate the word flick for movie. Anyway, so the list started off with maybe 24 words. It's probably close to 5 dozen words because I carried that same banned word list to airmail as well. So that was the beginning. And I edited every story, every caption, but I print the stories out. I edited only on paper at Vanity Fair, never on the computer. So I'd print the stories out where half the page was the text and there was an empty half page for edits. And the first couple of years, I went through 1 million HB pencils editing because I was trying to just peel away at the writing just to make it more readable, at least to me. And then bringing in writers who wrote the way I appreciated great writing.
We both agree Tina really saved Vanity Fair, but those words don't strike me as Tina Brown vocabulary, or were those just kind of part of her British vocab that she...
Or no, that was that. I don't know whether it was a house style, but to me as a reader, there was so much that I just found ridiculous.
Yeah, it was cloying. Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, that took about 9 months to a year to just clean that away.
I've been over your list several times, and my favorite was chortle.
Oh, I hate chortle. I hate wannabe. I even hate the word celebrity. I hate the expression A-list. I hate all of it.
No.
It's just so cheap. There was one writer at Vanity Fair who will go nameless, and I was editing one of her things. She must have had 8 banned words in a single paragraph. And all of a sudden I thought, is she having me on here? I mean, is she pulling my leg? But she wasn't. Anyway, that was a whole other thing. It's just getting rid of the language.
We'll be right back.
Print is Dead is made possible by the support of the Society of Publication Designers. The SPD powers the future of visual storytelling, setting the standard for editorial excellence and shaping the future of visual culture. For more information, visit spd.org.
You were very careful to parse earlier the difference between insecurity and anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
I'll phrase this very carefully, but you're very disarmingly open about your anxiety for quite a long time at Vanity Fair.
Oh, no, for the entire run.
The entire run.
100%, yes.
At one point, I forget how long you had been there. You talk about going in every day with the fear that you're going to be fired.
Well, that was in those first 2 years when there were rumors, both just orally in circles and in the newspaper. And there used to be one of those black boards. You used to see them in detective movies, black with little white letters that are stuck into the grooves. And it had the editor's names on it and size name at the top. And I would check it just before I got on the elevator to make sure my name was still there. And there was a couple that ran the newsstand, Helmut and Margit. And I thought if I was fired that I would see it in their face because they knew everything before anybody else. So the first 2 years, there was a lot of that.
Did you check in with them every morning?
I'd say, hey, good morning, guys. And I could just tell a cheery hello. And I thought, okay, I'm good for today. And also, I was not an American citizen. I had an H-1 visa. And loss of employment could have meant loss of the visa, which was tied to employment. And I could not be a freelancer with an H-1. So if I lost my job, if I didn't get another job immediately, I'd be shipped back to Canada.
Good thing Trump wasn't president.
Well, I'd be shipped to Guantanamo or Salvador. At this point, Guantanamo seems like the more charitable option.
So here's the question I'm going to ask, but I'll preface it by saying I used to do these very long interviews with some well-known entrepreneurs like Steve Jobs, many of them with highly successful people, but you had never heard their names before. And I can't tell you the number of times, sometimes on the record, people talked about this incredible anxiety they had, this imposter syndrome, that they always felt like it was going to catch up to them. People would realize they weren't anywhere near as good as the public image that they had. And I want to ask you a question, particularly for our younger listeners, which is, how do you not let that kind of anxiety really influence your day-to-day decision-making?
Oh, actually, I think it helped me for the simple reason that the anxiety was largely about putting out a great issue of the magazine. I do have social anxiety, but for large events, that's a whole other different thing.
Well, wait a second.
What?
You, the host of the big Oscar event, you have social anxiety?
Especially in something so dramatic. I've never been the host of anything at large before. And here I had 150 movie stars coming for dinner and then 150 coming after dinner at the very first one. And I think Scanlon had suggested I take a beta blocker. I took no pharmaceutical drugs whatsoever, but I got a prescription to a beta blocker. And so I'd take a nibble of that and a single ounce of vodka, and that would get me through the first hour and a half and settle me down a bit. Once I got over a threshold, the anxiety would reduce by about 50%, but it's never left me. And remember, the golden age was the golden age because magazines were phenomenal then. All editors were firing on all cylinders and everybody was competition. And a lot of our competition was weekly. And I had this big, lumbering, very thick magazine. And it took 4 days just to print Vanity Fair, to print like 1.5 million, 2 million copies. And they're often half an inch thick. So we couldn't turn on a dime the way some could. And there were issues where I thought, oh my God, this is so wonderful. This issue, it's got everything you want in a magazine. That would make me anxious because I thought this is the best I'm ever going to do. And the next one is not going to be that good. And then if I put out something that I thought was less than that, I thought I've lost the touch and it's all downhill from here. And I could always tell other editors who were anxious because their magazines were better. You could tell an editor who says, okay, I've got the job now, I can relax.
I'm surprised this issue of anxiety hasn't come up in any of the conversations I've had so far. I think one of the things reading your book did for me recently, certainly for this conversation, is it gives you permission to talk about it.
That's true. It's really crippling at times, too. I've worked on a bunch of things. In a large setting, what I do is I generally, if I'm going to stay there for any length of time, I'll make my way to a fixed point rather than mingle. Get to a fixed point and say, put your elbow on the bar and make that your workstation for the cocktail portion of the evening. And first of all, it grounds you, and then people will swing by, but wandering around the room is not my style and at all. And I do find that if you just smile and look like you're having a good time, that'll mask the anxiety in a major way and just tell people how fabulous they look.
That's true.
It was such a public job. And if you made a slip up, it'd be in the newspaper the next day. There was a guy called Keith Kelly at the New York Post he'd complain about a comma in the magazine, but the anxiety, it's diminished over the past 7 years, but it's still there.
Yeah, I'm not surprised.
Also, I tell young people when they come in as young assistants for one of the editors, I'd say, listen, you're in the excellence business and you've got to treat it that way every single day for the rest of your professional life, because every step of the way, you're a little further up the food chain. And so the fall is going to be further. It's one thing to fail as an assistant or an intern. It's another thing to fall from being an editor. That is punishing and you may not recover from it. So if you just understand this is the excellence business, and that's the job every single day for the rest of your professional life.
And as you point out, as you move up the masthead, the scrutiny becomes so
much worse, and the fall is much more punishing.
Let's shift for a second. I want to hear you talk about design and the whole visual character of the magazine at Vanity Fair, because I get the impression from the book that you think about it in a way that's quite different from a lot of editors. But in your own words, I want to hear, how did you think about and approach the question of what you wanted the visual identity of Vanity Fair to be under you?
I really learned to appreciate photography from working at Life. Not that I worked with the great photographers there, but they were in the offices, people like David Douglas Duncan, Alfred Eisenstadt, Ralph Morris. So I appreciated photography in a major way. And then I came to Vanity Fair and we built up a stable of photographers, including Helmut Newton and Andy Leibovitz and Mark Seliger, Jonathan Becker, Patrick de Marchelier, Herb Ritz, Slim Aaron shot for us, Cartier-Bresson shot for us. So I got to work with these amazing photographers. And I spent probably 45% to 50% of my time on the layout. We didn't do layouts on computers ever my time there. Everything was done in a planning room on a flat surface. And you would edit the pictures when they came in. And I wanted a magazine that looked epic because a lot of the stories were epic narratives. And also you wanted a million ways in for the reader. You wanted either the headline to capture their attention or a pull quote or a caption or the photographs. And so you wanted the readers, if a reader read 3 to 4 stories out of 10 in an issue, they'd be pleased and they'd come back the next month and you have a business. If they don't read 3, you go out of business.
It's interesting. You use the word epic. I've never heard anybody use that to describe either a visual identity or a story. Epic. It's a great word.
And we ran stories that ran as long as 20, 21,000 words. So you've got to have photographs that complement that and are worthy of that length. And having somebody like Annie was just the greatest gift of all.
How much direction would you or a photo editor give to someone like Annie?
Oh, a lot, and all of it would be ignored.
Of course.
No, if I said, I'd see this in black and white, she'd shoot in Technicolor. If I said, I think this should be really bright and colorful, it would be black and white. So somehow it all worked, but I don't think she ever once, not to my knowledge, took my advice on it. And by the way, nor should she.
Yeah. So let's shift to writers now. You made a comment in the book with which I wholeheartedly agree. And I know a lot of editors get miffed about this, but being a writer is difficult, much, much more difficult than being an editor on so many levels.
On every level.
On every level. Well, describe why you wrote that in the first place. And then I want to go on from there.
I was pretty good at ideas. So a writer would come in, we'd talk about an idea, and they'd have their editor with them. And then they would go off between 2 months, 4 months, being away from their family, and nervous that they would not get the story we were looking for. And so let's say in January 1st, you assigned a story. It would take maybe 3 months to report and write. So it comes in at the end of March. It would take a month and a half to fact check, to go through legal review, to get the photographs in, to lay it out. So this story might not appear in the magazine until May or June. You had to have stories that also had what they called in Hollywood legs, and that would be vital in May. And so that I treated most of them as the interim period between the news reports and books. I liked stories with a beginning, middle, and end. I wanted stories that had conflict, that had access to the major figures, and that had disclosure, that you moved the scholarship along in some way.
You were very explicit about that in the book.
Very. And so I love conflict. You need conflict. It's got to be man against nature, two men against each other for a company or a woman, or two countries in battle over a territory. And that is the essence of a great narrative story.
And you say you wanted to make sure the writers at Vanity Fair really felt loved and appreciated. So how did you do that? How did it manifest itself?
First of all, I did love them and appreciate them. So that was authentic. Some writers would get flowers if they turned in a big, very difficult story. When they turned it in, I'd send scotch on a regular basis to a number of them. They got very elaborate Christmas gifts, and I wrote them thank you notes after every single issue. I wrote thank you notes to every advertiser and every writer and every photographer after every issue for 25 years.
How many thank you notes? Those 400-page issues you're talking about.
Sometimes it would be 450, 500 notes.
Oh, my God.
Yeah, it would take a day. But I thought it was vital. I thought, I know how I work best, and I work best when I feel that the person I'm working for is appreciative and respectful of what I do. And I only know that way. And so that's the way I treated the writers, rather than making them fearful for their jobs or anything like that. And it worked, and it still works for me. And I wanted editors who felt the same way, because so many of the writers were on exclusive contract to Vanity Fair. So their livelihood, their reputation, their professional progress was dependent on getting stories into the magazine. And so the editor's job was both being an editor, an agent, and a career manager. And so their job was to get their writers' stories into the magazine.
You also didn't pay kill fees.
No. And I remember there were a number of magazines. I remember hearing about a magazine, a major magazine, that would order up two versions of the same story, choose the best one, and pay the other writer a kill fee of 25%. And I thought that was punishing. But no, I paid 100% regardless of whether we ran it. And if the writer had what I would call punted the story, we'd be less likely to hire them again. But I paid them off for this story.
And I remember there was one story that came in. You were unbelievably impressed with it, but for some reason it wasn't published. And so you paid twice the original kill fee.
Oh, no. Oh, no. I wanted a story on this man, Sidney Korshak, who was the Chicago mob's lawyer in Hollywood.
Yes.
Famous fixer. He was more powerful than any studio head or agent. And this is pre-internet. There was nothing on him. And I assigned it to Nick Tosches, who was a legend in music criticism and reporting, and had written an amazing book about Dean Martin. And Nick was a very cool fellow, and he disappeared for a year, and it was on our planning board. It kept moving along. I thought, okay, he's never going to turn it in. And then one day, a manuscript arrived about a half an inch thick, brown paper envelope, and I took it out, and it was a Sidney Korshak story, and I read it in one sitting. It was 17,000 words.
Wow.
I asked for 8,000 words, but I called him up and I almost had tears in my eyes. I said, this is so wonderful. This will be the best story I've published up to this point, and we're going to pay you double the fee. It was an incredible piece.
I do remember something else you did that was extraordinary. And again, I'm trying to remember the story.
Lloyd's of London.
Lloyd's, yes.
Well, David McClintock, who had written Indecent Exposure and a number of other huge, wonderful books, one of the great reporters of the Wall Street Journal. And he came to me with an idea. He wanted to do a story on the collapse of Lloyd's of London, saying that it would affect the wealth of nations and that it would bring down the British aristocracy. So I signed the story to him. He had to move to London for 3 months. Then he extended that to 6 months, and there was still no story. This went on, and then he came back. Lloyd's had collapsed in a way, but the wealth of nations was not affected. And so he wanted to go back to London for another 3 months. We already had about $180,000 in expenses in this story.
Wow.
And I said, listen, this was like Vietnam for me. I just decided I'm going to cut my loss. I said, David, you can take it elsewhere. And so Norm Pearlstein, who had been his editor of the Journal, was then running Time Incorporated. And so he went to Time, and I think he finished the reporting and ran in one of their international editions.
It was huge, too.
It was huge, but it was not the story that David thought it was going to become.
Yeah, when I say huge, I mean it ran 24 pages.
24 pages, yes. But David is like one of the great reporters of all time. Maybe I should have run it, but I just couldn't invest any more money in it. My managing editor, Chris Garrett, and I would have a meeting about it once a week as the bills came in. And even for us, it was too much.
I want to wrap up this particular part of the conversation by asking, were there days when you just felt, however successful Vanity Fair was, that the level of money that was being spent was just obscene?
No. And I'll tell you why. No. Because most of the money was spent with purpose to get the best talent we could get and to get the best stories we could get. Vanity Fair in those days, the advertising pages were upwards of $100,000 a page. And a lot of that came from fashion companies. And I never did a fashion spread my whole 25 years there. So the only other people who got those pages were fashion magazines like Vogue and Harper's Bazaar. So I had to produce a magazine that was really compelling, but that attracted those people and with tough stories, but that wouldn't necessarily scare them off either. And Cy was brilliant. Everything was spent with a purpose. Furthermore, Cy had inherited the third tier magazine publisher in the country. There was Time Incorporated at the top when Cy took over. Then came Hearst with Esquire and Harper's Bazaar. And then came Condé Nast with Mademoiselle and Glamour and a bunch of finishing school magazines. And over the 5, 6, 7-year period, he built Condé Nast into the dominant magazine publisher in the country. And so he wanted his magazines to be big and to be spectacular. And they were, and the money flowed in from readers and from advertisers. So it was all spent, and maybe there was excesses, small excesses here and there, but it was all spent with purpose.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense to me.
It's wonderful, but it was spent with purpose.
Yeah. As a reader of the book, I have to say sometimes it does get a little bit overwhelming because the gap between what even other successful magazines, we were obscenely profitable at Inc., but not on that scale.
Well, Condé Nast was private. Remember, I'd done 2 things on a shoestring, so it was wonderful to have all these financial levers at my disposal.
Oh, I can imagine.
I've done both, and having the money is nicer than not having the money.
Yes, it is. As we begin to wrap things up here,
Yeah.
bring us up to date on airmail. There are rumors all over the place about every conceivable aspect of airmail. What's happening there?
When we had Spy, Cy came to us at the 2-year mark and wanted to buy it. And Kurt and Tom Phillips and I talked about it. And we said we thought it would be best if we stay independent. And that was probably both a good decision and a crazy decision because it's very hard to be independent. I think it's very important to be on your own as you're getting started up and launching. And I don't want to make the same mistake twice. I would like to find a partner for airmail, either to merge with somebody or to be part of something larger so that it can continue on into the future.
How's that going?
It's going. It's not a fast process. And there's people interested, and some people I'm interested in, and some people I'm not so interested in. So it'll work its way out some way or another this year.
So you're not looking for a capital raise. You're really looking for a partner.
A partner. Yeah.
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 Well, I hope it works out well.
Thank you.
Yeah, I love airmail.
Thanks.
It's the closest thing I've seen to a digital magazine.
I think it's the closest thing to a magazine on the internet because
Yeah.
it's put together by magazine people. We don't know any better.
Thank God.
Thank God.
Speaking of Vanity Fair and the current environment, Radhika Jones just stepped down.
Okay.
I think she's done a really good job under trying financial circumstances.
Yeah,
I'm
great.
sure. What was it like for you? Once you've run a magazine for 2 decades, you have to have a special place for it in your heart.
The thing is, I used to have a comp list of 400 names that I'd send out to people all over America and Europe and Britain. And she took me off the comp list when she took over. And so I actually haven't held a copy of Vanity Fair in 7 years.
She took you off the
Off
comp
the
list.
comp list. And I haven't followed it that closely.
When you say she took you off, Radhika took you off?
Yes.
Why would she have done that?
I have no idea. But anyway, I check it on Apple News Plus just to count the number of advertising pages because I'm a really small person. And other than that, I can read a couple of Gabe Sherman stories, but not much else.
Okay. What do you imagine it might be like for a young, and I'm assuming it's going to be a youngish editor, trying to run a magazine in this environment?
You're going to have to be a lot smarter than the competition. And the competition is fierce. But if you're clever, as I say, shoestring magazines can be very inventive, as you were saying as well.
But do you still think there's a niche for Vanity Fair?
With a clever editor, yes. With a complacent editor, no.
You got a candidate in mind?
All the people who I suggested when I left the magazine, I think should be considered. Dana Brown, William E. Cohan, Ann Fullenwider. There was a whole slew of them. Most of them are now otherwise occupied.
I'll be curious to see how the search ends. Okay, I have to ask you two questions. One is it's just a personal one of mine. I'd like to hear what you, as a Canadian, think about the Canadian response to Trump's talk about a hostile takeover. The response among Canadians seems to have been extraordinary, but I have to confess that my image of that has been shaped solely by the hockey games that I watch, which are numerous.
Yeah, I find booing the American national anthem not the right way to do it. I think Mark Carney, who I hope becomes prime minister, I think that, first of all, he's been in these rooms for the last decade and a half. He's got a wry, clever wit. I think he'll run rings around Trump. And it has unified Canadians in a wonderful way. Canadians are different than Americans. They like being Canadians. And this has pulled them together. I think there's a great sense of national pride. And I don't know whether this is some idle, crazy boast of his, but it has done wonders for the Canadian disposition.
It seems to have, doesn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, it's extraordinary. I think there's going to be more of this. In Greenland, it's having the same effect.
Yes. And so I don't think it's going to happen, but I think it's done wonders for Canada. And first of all, never go into a cold climate like Russia or Canada. Napoleon tried it, Hitler tried it, and both fared badly. Canadians are great in the cold. And remember, they can skate and fight at the same time.
For more on this and all of our episodes, visit our website where, in addition to complete transcripts of all our interviews, along with portfolios, archival photos, links, and other great information on our guests, you'll find our blog, Entry Points, about all things magazine, and our ever-expanding swag shop with all kinds of great custom merch. You can also support the podcast by clicking the adorable yellow button at the top of the page, all available at magazium.co.
Print is Dead, Long Live Print is a member of the Hub and Spoke Audio Collective, a nonprofit association of audio storytellers dedicated to promoting and sustaining high-quality, independent podcasting. Learn more at hubspokeaudio.org.
Magazium is made possible by the generous support of listeners like you. If you love our shows and can't wait for new episodes, or even if you just listen from time to time and love knowing we're here, please consider making a donation to help keep us going. Visit magazium.co/support.
Print is Dead, Long Live Print is a production of Magazium, LLC. For more information, visit our website, magazium.co, or follow us on social media at magazium.co. Please give us a like and a review on your favorite podcast app. It really helps. Thanks very much for listening.